This Voice of San Diego podcast is brought to you by Manalatus Nelson Murphy, Advertising and Public Relations. As a nonprofit news organization, we depend on our members, foundations, and sponsors like M&M to provide funding to support the investigative journalism you expect from Voice of San Diego. We are very grateful for all of our supporters, and we will recognize them during the show. M&M is run by Tony Manalatus, Bob Nelson, and Kelly Murphy Lampkin, who bring a vast network and decades of experience to developers, public agencies, campaigns, and others. M&M bridges the gap between clients and the people whose influence matters most. M&M develops successful strategies and implements cost-effective tactics to help clients achieve their goals. The firm specializes in public affairs PR and advertising, with an emphasis on media relations, crisis communications, community engagement, and cross-platform marketing. Our reporters at Voice of San Diego have heard from Tony and Bob a lot over the years. Tony, Bob, and Kelly are supporters of Voice of San Diego. Learn more about their firm at mnmadpr.com. And if you like Voice of San Diego's work and want to become a sponsor too, contact us at development@voiceofsandiego.org.
Welcome to the Voice of San Diego podcast, where we make sense of local politics, schools, housing, public safety, the civic issues that impact the life of a San Diego resident. We break it down so you can understand it and make educated decisions.
Everything that goes into our investigative reporting, the journalists, public records requests, the data crunching, and this very show depends on the support of people like you because we're a nonprofit news organization. Enjoy the show.
Boy, so speaking of public records requests, we have a live one this morning.
Breaking news.
Had to file a
TRO.
A TRO, temporary restraining order against the San Diego school. We've got more to talk about on that. I'm Scott Lewis. We are, of course, recording in partnership with News Radio 600 Kogo for our podcast this week. And I'm here with my friend Andrew Keatts.
What's up, buddy?
And Sara Libby.
Hey.
Yeah, so more on that coming up. Big fight. Got to stop them from destroying old emails. We also have a lot going on today in the show. We've got Maya Sri Krishnan coming in to talk about her stories about the inundation of misdemeanor cases in the federal court system with Jeff Sessions' decision to have a zero-tolerance policy on those who illegally cross the border. Don't just send them to immigration, get them through the federal court. And that means federal court people have to deal with it. And boy, it's been wreaking some havoc there. So we've got some discussion about that. Also, on the news front, we have a live show scheduled tentatively for July 18th. Now, I think it's not tentative anymore. I think it's real. So mark your calendar, Change your vacation, cancel all your plans.
Stop trying to book campsites through the state's system.
Do everything you have to move things around. We're going to have some fun. July 18th. Man, this time of year, I don't know. We got elections going on. It's my favorite time of the seasons, but it's also my least favorite because on the one hand, it's everything I care about. It's like being resolved. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, people are really hard to deal with.
People are something.
They're very sensitive about every possible word that you use, every decision you make.
A lot of words you don't use is something that gets people upset.
For that matter, stories that aren't written.
Stories you don't write.
Stories you don't write, stories you do write. Always could be doing more. And we always try to do our best and prioritize the most important elections. So in order to do that, so we have a few days till the election, might be natural to do a big election show. So that's what we've decided to do. We're going to do a special elections podcast, the three of us. And it'll come out on Monday, we hope.
Yeah, so be in your feed for your Monday morning commute.
And then hopefully, after the election, we'll be able to do one to sort of summarize how things went.
Yeah,
Are there any surprises?
Yeah, we'll do that late Tuesday night. If you're living and breathing with the election, you could listen to it then. Otherwise, it'll be in your feed for your Tuesday morning commute.
I've been doing the mailer thread of all the mailers.
Yeah.
And I had them all spread out on my floor the other day. I was taking pictures and documenting all their interesting parts. and my son ran into the room and he slipped and fell, and I didn't even look up. I was like,
occupational hazards are now extending to your children.
Yeah, he's like, I fell, and I'm like, are you okay? I didn't even look up. Yeah, exactly. These mailers they're a nuisance. There's so many of them, but I lost my heart. They're so mean. I just lost my heart. So.
This last week is where the really mean stuff comes out.
It's really brutal. All right, so we're going to talk about other things for this show, and I wanted to bring up the first topic about the San Diego Association of Governments. So we've been talking about for the last several months, about the new law, SB 805. AB, sorry.
It's A.
This one's an A. And this changed the governance.
Just never let that happen again.
Sorry. Changed the governance at SANDAG. Now lay the groundwork for us, Andrew Keatts.
So it used to be the case that any decision at SANDAG needed to essentially pass 2 votes at once. One was a tally vote of all the cities who are on the board, and one was weighted by the relative populations of those cities. Now one way to think of it is it's both the House and the Senate at once.
Got it. Now you did some work a few years ago about the incredible unanimity of the SANDAG board. And that what you explained then was that they just never have contentious votes. It was always unanimous votes.
There's virtually never a contentious vote. There's virtually never any sort of debate or dispute at these public hearings. It's
very rare. Unusual because they're a pretty diverse group representing different geographies, different political sides.
You've got very conservative cities, rural cities, urban cities, liberal cities, diverse cities, mostly white cities. You've got all of these on one board, and somehow they consistently would make very unanimous decisions with seemingly no dispute between them.
Got it. So those 2 factors have come into coexistence now with a new issue.
Yeah.
So the new issue is about housing. Now, I didn't understand the significance of this until you explained it. So explain to me the issue and why it's significant.
Well, so the state has for decades had something called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, whereas the state makes a determination about how big it thinks that the state will get over an 8-year period, and then it allots each region a certain required amount of housing to accommodate that much growth. This has always been a relatively feckless exercise because there were no teeth behind it. You might have this regional housing needs assessment, and all these cities were required ostensibly to create housing elements that demonstrated how they would comply with this plan, but there were never any consequences if you didn't comply with the plan. And in the end, very few cities ever actually built the housing that they were, technically required to build.
Right. So they just had these plans sitting on shelves.
It was kind of like the number would be useful for like the EDC or like some sort of board that was trying to decide how to grow or change or whatever. It'd say like, well, we need 100,000 homes or something like that.
Something like that. Or it would, it might have been interesting for data perspectives, but it was not there were no teeth to the state law. Last year, Scott Wiener, a Bay Area senator, passed a law that changed that in one particular instance. Basically said, if you are a city who has not met your housing needs, then you cannot reject projects that meet certain descriptions. If you have a certain amount of affordable housing, if they're in certain areas, if you pay union labor standards, then it's just approved. You become a ministerially approved project. And then he has another bill that is working its way through the legislature that goes even further. So they're making these small steps to say, if you are out of compliance with this state law, then there are going to be consequences in the way that you are forced to accept certain amounts of housing.
Put most simply, if you want to build housing and your city is out of alliance or compliance with this, and your project fits those goals, you can sail through the process a lot easier.
Yeah, cheaper, more quickly. Yeah, exactly.
And which is a principle that a lot of builders have been pushing for a long time, and a lot of political allies of them have been pushing for a long time.
Yeah, it's much like realtors will always tell you that it's a good time to buy.
Mm-hmm.
Home builders will always tell you it's a good time to deregulate.
Right, and that in fact is the single most important obstacle in the way of affordable housing from the perspective of these folks is that it's too hard to build.
Yeah, and so I'm going to jump forward here if that's okay with you.
You bet.
Okay, so the state has made its initial gambit to the county about the number of homes that we were going to be required for this next cycle, 170,000 new homes. A couple weeks ago, SANDAG board voted to ask for a lower number. Said basically, we're going to quibble with some of your determinations here. Let's call it 116,000. They voted to do that. There was some dissent. The city of La Mesa passed its own resolution to ask the state to ignore SANDAG's request for a lower number. Assemblyman Todd Gloria did the same. And then SANDAG's board did something interesting last week, which was they reintroduced for the idea that maybe they should rediscuss this item, that their decision to ask for a lower number they should have that discussion a second time. So that was what happened last week.
And so they decided to have that discussion.
They had a discussion to reschedule the discussion.
Got it. And so this came at a moment, now we can draw back to that knowledge we have about how the governance structures changed, the voting structures changed, and they say, should we have this again? And the board says, nah.
Yeah. So they vote, they do a tally vote, it doesn't pass. And then, very dramatically, Councilmember Myrtle Cole from the city of San Diego says, I'd like to call for the weighted vote.
Now, remember this body. So we're talking about mayors and city council members from across the region, all in this room. It's like a United Nations of cities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so our representatives on this board are two people, the mayor, Kevin Faulkner, and Myrtle Cole, the city council member.
And historically, the mayor has not gone very often. His alternate is Lori Zaff. She is basically a regular member of the SANDAG board.
And partly because it had so much unanimity before, right? There was no point.
Right.
But now these cities, including the city of San Diego, have a lot of power.
Yes.
Because they can trigger this weighted vote.
Yeah, and so he is there in attendance as well. Myrtle Cole calls for a weighted vote. Mayor Faulkner announces that he's in support of it. Once you have both of San Diego's votes announcing that they're going to be in the same direction, like, you're basically there. You just need a couple more cities to jump on board. And in fact, a couple more cities do, and the weighted vote passes.
But not before one of the most entertaining episodes I have heard about in local public affairs happens. Jim Desmond, mayor of San Marcos, Republican, who ostensibly is one of those folks who thinks that the obstacles to building homes is part of the reason why there's not affordable housing.
Yeah.
He grabs his marbles and said, I'm going home.
Yeah, he gets into a dispute with the legal counsel about whether this is a proper application of Robert's Rules of Order.
Sure.
They actually read the relevant passage to him.
Isn't public affairs great?
Yeah,
unsatisfactory. Robert's Rules.
Yeah, yes. They got into a dispute about whether contrast or exception was the language in the Robert's Rules of Order.
They did.
Yeah, it was great.
Woo!
Hot stuff, man. Spicy.
I'm sure people are gripping their steering wheel right now. Just like, this is the good shit.
Yep.
And so he loses. They go forward with the vote, and as they're getting ready to press the buttons for the weighted vote, he just says, I'm not voting. And he storms off.
Storms out.
He leaves the boardroom.
Okay, I can't get over this because in my professional career, there's been maybe 2 or 3 times where I've wanted to storm out of a meeting.
Was I
You had a factor in 1 or 2 of them.
Okay.
But I didn't, because that would be insanely immature. And that was in front of like 4 people.
Not only is it insanely immature, but it's like, this is the hill you're going to die on of like lowering the housing number?
Yeah, like
to be clear,
to
schedule whether you would like to revote lowering the housing number.
Especially if you're somebody who wants to make it easier ostensibly to build housing, which this would do. You're so mad that they're doing this that you're going to storm out of the building in front of San Diego's most influential political leaders the whole region's, again, the leaders of the whole region.
Also, like, while you're in the midst of running for office?
Yes.
Although
I don't know that this was bad for him politically.
Yeah.
But it shows that the alignment of his politics might be more toward the concerns about growth in his neighborhoods than in removing obstacles to building homes, which was ostensibly the plank.
Yeah, there's a lot tied up in this where it's like, wherein you have, and a lot of this is just housing politics in general and housing politics in California specifically, not saying much at all about San Diego or San Marcos, which is that so there's the state here.
Yeah.
There's the specter of the state telling locals what to do,
right,
which is not something that mayors of any kind typically like, and certainly not one that Republican mayors like. So I think that is part of the issue. And then there's like this idea of wanting to be pro-development or pro-deregulation, but in a certain way, but at a certain time and place. And so you can,
or is it easier to have that as an excuse? Is it easier to have that as a boogeyman than it is to actually take it down? Like, is it actually worse? So a lot going on there. It's a big issue going forward, but it was also the first public use of this vote.
Yes, this was the first public use of the weighted vote, and it is an open question about how often that will be used or in what instances it will be used. It was interesting watching it happen because there's just a group of people who are accustomed to very much having not just their say on the board, but I think it's fair to describe it mathematically as a disproportionate say on that board, who really do not like the new regime.
Well, it could come up more. There was another issue this week that got a lot of people's attention. Most of the city's most insiders were abuzz Wednesday about the oral arguments at the California Supreme Court about Proposition B. So this was that 2012 Citizens Initiative that won overwhelmingly, and it ended guaranteed pensions for new employees at the city of San Diego, the great comprehensive pension reform. Of course, it left out police officers who still get pensions. So at issue is this question. The unions say that the mayor at the time, Jerry Sanders, who was one of the proponents, literally listed as a leader of the proposition, one of the proponents of the initiative, that he actually should have met with the city's labor unions before he went forward with this proposition. And that's because as the city's mayor, he is the city's CEO, he is the city's lead labor negotiator. And California law, the Miles-Millis-Brown Act, requires meet and confer before unionized workers have new conditions sort of imposed on them. That means you have to at least go to the union and say, this is what I want to do. And the idea being that they will shine a light on things you haven't thought about, or maybe they'll help you reach your goals, or if they can't, then you can go ahead and do what you have to do.
Now, I do think it's important to note that that process can end in a stalemate and you can move forward without the union. So it is not a veto. It's just a requirement to meet.
Right. So the California Supreme Court justices did not seem very receptive to the argument of the proponents of the initiative that Mayor Sanders was acting as his own sort of private citizen. The justices seemed more sympathetic to the idea that the mayor was the mayor and he wasn't a private citizen. Here was Chief Justice Tani Cantil-Sakaue talking about the distinction proponents were trying to make that Sanders was acting as a private citizen when he signed on as leader of the initiative, as captured by Andrew Bowen, who was monitoring the hearing at KPBS.
But he also has a role that he can't deny as chief labor negotiator. And he's acting as a private citizen in contra to his role as private labor negotiator. It's inconsistent with his role. He doesn't get to pick and choose which parts of his title and responsibilities he gets to disregard.
He doesn't get to pick and choose what he likes to disregard. You often make a point about this in the tweets.
Yes.
And in the office.
Yeah, it's similar.
It's like 0.400 of the Andrew Keatts file.
Well, I have to admit that I became a devout believer in this opinion based on my good friend Sara Libby, so I should really let her go run with it.
I don't even know what you guys are talking about.
The audacity of people attempting to make a statement not in the
I mean,
not
if you're the mayor,
speaking
you're the mayor. You don't get to and not only was he the mayor, but he was doing this with his name on the initiative and with the seal. And I mean, they were like literally in the mayor's office talking about this, right?
Yeah, and so the point Scott was making was like that I often get into Twitter spats about like no one having the right or ability to suggest that they're saying something outside of any
we get that
capacity.
a lot. Like, yes, I'm the president of this organization, but I'm not speaking as the president when I'm saying this. I'm speaking as Stacy, who lives in North Park, like.
No. Yeah, I mean, if
your various identities.
If the mayor goes to his local community planning group to say, I really hate that we're putting a stop sign here. But by the way, I'm not speaking as the mayor. I'm just speaking as the resident of 1234 Wago Drive. It's absurd. It's every bit as newsworthy as if he said it in any other context.
Right.
Well, it has significance here. So if he did violate that law, then they would have to grapple with it. So the justices didn't actually ask in this hearing, even though it came off really negatively, it seemed like, for the proponents of the initiative, they didn't actually talk much about what would you do to fix it? What would be your remedy? Which I think some supporters of the initiative are clinging to, that maybe they won't throw this out. Because if they throw this out, that is a cluster. That is a mess.
I can't even begin to. I mean, because you've got people who have years now of. If you were hired after June 2012, you did not walk into the city of San Diego with a pension, and so you've been working for years not accumulating a pension.
Yeah. So there are 3,000 to 4,000 people who were hired after this initiative passed who have basically a 401k style matching investment program. So they have a 9.2% match. That seems high. Like we get 4, right? And we don't get 9.2, except that we get Social Security. They do not get Social Security. So that's 6.2% that is there, plus the 3% on top. So they get only 3% on top. And so any decision to invalidate Proposition B would trigger, I think, an incomprehensible series of decisions after that. I've been talking to people all week trying to understand what would happen after that. So there is one idea that all these 401ks that the city, if it got totally invalidated, they could take the city's contribution out of these 401ks, even with what it earned, and build it into the pension system, and the people could take their contribution out and make their contribution to the pension system with it.
And just pay the penalty that you get for prematurely removing money from a 401k.
There's a whole bunch of tax implications they haven't worked out like that. There's another theory that they could just like slap the city on the wrist somehow and say you shouldn't have done it this way, but continue on. Then there's a whole issue of there might be a lot of employees who don't want to take their money over to an actual guaranteed pension system and want to leave it in these 401ks. All right, we're going to wrap that up after this with Hero and Goat, and also our discussion with Maya Srikrishnan. But this is the first part of the show, produced in partnership, News Radio 600. Go.
Voice of San Diego podcasts are sponsored in part by the San Diego Tourism Authority. As a nonprofit news organization, we depend on our members, foundations, and sponsors like the San Diego Tourism Authority to provide funding to support the investigative journalism you expect from us. We are very grateful for all of our supporters, and we will recognize them during the show. From the 1 in 8 local jobs provided by the tourism industry to the $289 million in hotel room tax revenue generated for the city's general fund, San Diegans have many reasons to be proud to live in a destination powered by tourism. As a nonprofit organization with a mission of promoting travel to San Diego, the San Diego Tourism Authority celebrates what tourism means to our community. Find out why at sandiego.org/impact. And if you like the Voice of San Diego's work and want to become a sponsor too, contact us at development@voiceofsandiego.org.
We are back. Andrew, you had a couple more points?
Well, so the last thing I want to say about Prop B was back after the appellate ruling, before the MEA decided to appeal and the Supreme Court decided to take it up, and before this argument, I talked to a bunch of lawyers who pointed out what seemed pretty clear to me, which is this just opens up a pretty obvious loophole that you would have to ask yourself, if you ever wanted to make any change that affected municipal employees, why would you ever choose to do anything other than just go through a citizens initiative process if, in fact, this is a way to get around meet and confer?
Something big like this. I talked to proponents of the initiative, and I was really pressing them on this point. Like, I think that, if you talk to the labor unions and stuff, they're like, well, we could sit down, if they did throw this out, we could sit down and have a big negotiation, just try to figure it out, right? We could sit down and do that and come out with, what are the city's objectives? What are our objectives? What can we do to work things out? Mm-hmm. And I think what that misses is that what Prop B was about in many ways, it did freeze salaries, pensionable salaries for 5 years. That was not insignificant in the health of the pension system. But it was so similar to the old pension system that ending pensions going forward was really a much more symbolic discussion and an important symbolic thing to a lot of people. I think a lot of people on the right especially wanted to do something that was understandable to citizens, that was clear, that could kind of put the last chapter on the pension scandal, right? Ending pensions and freezing the pay for all employees except police officers sort of did that trick. And so no fix to this that's negotiated in, labor discussions or whatever achieves that. You know what I mean? Like, and so if you're stuck that has to happen, then what's going to happen is another citizens initiative.
Right. I mean, so you would need to finance a citizens initiative. Citizens initiatives aren't cheap. So it would have to be a big thing that somebody is willing to put up $1 million to do. Right. So it's not like some minor change in like the length of lunch hour for employees.
Right.
Is likely to demand that sort of attention. But it's just like the land use decisions that we've made, where like the Citizens Initiative creates this major carve out for CEQA. Now there's a Citizens Initiative that creates a major carve out for meet and confer.
Right.
It's like all these legislative processes that are difficult that we've built in through law that you don't have to follow if you go through the Citizens Initiative process, which seems to me to offer a pretty heavy incentive to go through the Citizens Initiative process if those are things you'd like to do.
Right. Our hero of the week. So activist Mike McConnell, who's been working in the homeless and philanthropic circles for quite some time now, noticed something that our Lisa Halverstadt has been digging into over the last week or two. UT did a little thing on it as well. And so there was ostensibly some good news a couple of weeks back about the number of homeless residents in San Diego and that it had gone down. Right, Sarah?
Yeah, so they held a press conference. This is the annual point in time count, the census of the homeless residents living in the region. And leaders got together and said, good news, homelessness went down. Big issue in San Diego, and we're working to solve it.
There was press conference. It was a big discussion. Like, whew, we got a little break in this high tide. It was a bad thing, maybe getting a little bit better, but they didn't count some folks.
Yeah. So it turns out there were possibly hundreds of people living in RVs who were not counted every year up until now. Those folks have been included in the number, and they decided this year to exclude it from the number. And also a big facility, the San Diego Rescue Mission, was not included in this year's count, and it has been in years past. And in years past, it has also included hundreds of people. And so together, that's, several hundreds of people who were left out of this count. And presumably if they were in, then homelessness would not have gone down. It would, in fact, probably have shown a modest increase.
Yeah, so according to Lisa's reporting, if the rescue mission's numbers were consistent with what they've reported in the past about how many people were staying there, the task force could have reported more than 9,260 homeless San Diegans this year, and that would have been up from the 8,576 that they detailed in this earlier report this month, and up from last year's 9,116 reported. So that's a lot. There's a lot of ifs there. Again, we don't have the specific number from the rescue mission, but it doesn't look like, I don't know. How do they do this? How do they change the methodology, but then have discussions in public that say things went down a little bit?
Yeah, if you want to change the methodological changes are maybe defensible. Sure. You talk about it. You talk about it a lot. You don't just say that things went down 6% when you've made a big change that resulted in things being lower.
So some of the people in that press conference, I believe, said they didn't know that number was excluded. So that includes Ron Robertson, Councilman Chris Ward. And so that's certainly something that they're probably going to be asking about.
Really? I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So, and then there's, a lot of the explanation from officials with the Task Force on the Homelessness as to, why they decided to leave this out and when they made that decision and whether it was something that HUD recommended or did not recommend. Those are some big questions that I think people will be very eager to find out in the next few weeks.
Wow. All right. Our GOAT of the week.
You lose! Good day, sir!
So on May 9th, NBC 7, San Diego reported that the San Diego Unified School District, after a year of considering the issue, was going to delete all old emails beginning Friday. So emails over a year old. So last year, district leaders, you might remember, had been deciding whether to delete emails older than 6 months, but a lot of us lit our hair on fire about that. They pulled back from that, decided to discuss the issue more. But now a spokesperson told the NBC that employee prep is nearly complete. The servers will not store email older than a year, effective June 1st. District officials said that last year that that deleting these old emails would save money and alleviate the burden of public records requests.
Such a burden replying to the law and following your obligations.
I mean, I know that I hear this all the time. It's such a pain for them to respond to our public records requests and others, but they shouldn't think about that. That's like saying it's such a pain delivering water, or it's such a pain filling potholes. Like, it's just a part of the service you're expected to provide.
Yeah.
So then last year, the district claimed that it spends millions of dollars storing emails on servers, but it turned out that estimate included other non-email storage costs.
Yeah, they have a cloud-based email system, which is free. So we're very interested in hearing more about how this actually costs money.
So we have filed a temporary restraining order in local court to stop them from deleting. And I'm proud to say that as of 2:30 Friday, they have agreed not to until they can hear this. And so we will hopefully have an update soon. And part of what we're worried about is we're unsure whether many of our public records requests that go back into this time period that would be deleted are okay or not, because they literally aren't getting us back.
They will have found a way to subvert the law, in effect, by delaying our public records requests for years in some cases, only to cross this threshold where they say, well, now these emails are a year old and we get to delete them without ever having produced them, even though we requested them more than a year ago.
Right. So there's two public records issues here. One is that they would like to be able to delete the records and not have as much of a standard of keeping them. The other is that they're amazingly terrible at responding to records requests in any way, such that it takes months and years to get routine responses that every other agency manages to do much better than them.
Yeah.
And so they somehow get to combine those things in a way that helps them, which is pretty interesting.
So we will have an update soon on that. I hope that they've, regardless of what is resolved by the hearing, that they've protected some of those records that we've requested. So, all right, let's move on to the chaos and some of the havoc in federal courts. So in 1994, federal officials decided to prioritize repeat offenders when they caught people who were crossing the border illegally. But recently, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced a zero-tolerance policy for all of the people who were caught with these kinds of offenses. And now misdemeanor cases have flooded federal court. Defense attorneys, U.S. Marshals, and even judges aren't sure how to handle the influx. In fact, it's gotten so intense that it actually is eclipsing some of the biggest years. So Maya Srikrishnan, our reporter, she found that in 2008, which was the highest year on record for for misdemeanor prosecutions at the federal court, there were 936 for the whole year. But in just 1 week this month, there were 113. Just sort of illustrates how much is going on. Maya joins us in studio. Maya, what is going on?
So back in April, the federal government, specifically Attorney General Jeff Sessions, announced that he was going to start prosecuting every single person who crossed the border in between the ports of entry. So, people who crossed without any authorization. And this has resulted, particularly in the Southern District of California, where we hadn't been prosecuting a lot of these cases in criminal courts, in a flood of prosecutions in the past month.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just back up for a second. Even though we're talking about immigration and we're talking about court, we're not talking about immigration court, which is a separate thing. Can you explain a little bit the difference between what is happening here and what a deportation is?
So a deportation is handled by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and that is processed through the Executive Office of Immigration Review, which handles the immigration courts. Those are administrative courts that specifically deal with immigration issues and whether someone has the right to stay in this country or whether they will be deported. These are criminal prosecutions. So this means someone will be passed over to ICE afterwards to likely be deported if they are prosecuted. But they'll also have a felony or a misdemeanor on their rap sheet that is for illegal reentry or illegal entry. And that could mean that if they want to try to come back to the U.S. later and try and find a legal path, they might have more trouble. It also means that they could be spending time in U.S. jails before they are deported.
Let me ask you, so if you jump over the fence or at some point like Smuggler's Gulch or somewhere where it's easier to cross, you get across, somebody gets you, that's a misdemeanor.
If it is your first time or if you've only done it a couple of other times, it's a misdemeanor. If you've done it like 6 or 10 times, it can be raised to a felony.
And in the past, what would happen to them versus what happens now?
So, well, back in the 70s and 80s, we used to try and prosecute as many of those as possible. And then in 1994, they made a shift where basically the U.S. attorney at the time decided that those misdemeanors were resulting in, time in jail of 10 days to 15 days, and it wasn't really stopping people from trying again. And so he felt that it was a better use of court resources to try and elevate the offenses that they could to felonies and then leave the rest to immigration officials.
So if they got caught and as a misdemeanor for crossing the border, they would just go immediately to immigration proceedings and not necessarily the court proceedings about their misdemeanor. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I mean, they were never charged with a misdemeanor, but if they couldn't be charged with a felony, then yes, they would just go straight to...
So it wasn't that they were like let into the country or whatever. They were put through immigration proceedings and removed.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And so now, again, just to clarify, you're saying that all these people are coming in, they're getting hit with misdemeanors, and then they're going to immigration court. So it's like they're just reinforcing, and what Sessions wants to do is really make sure that whatever can be sort of tagged to these people is being tagged to them, right?
Yeah, and he's adding, an extra level of punishment, ostensibly. So, these people will have to spend some time in prisons before they go, and that's supposed to be some sort of deterrent.
And so when he announced this change in policy and said, we're going to go back to the way we used to do things pre-1994, we're going to start charging up as much as we can when we detain somebody. Did that come with any resources or any sort of additional ability for the court system to handle that influx of newly charged crimes?
He did announce that he was sending additional prosecutors and judges. There's probably only a couple that would end up in the federal court in San Diego, for example, in each place. So, I mean, you're talking about 2 or 3 additional prosecutors at a court that has an influx of hundreds of extra cases every week. And whether that's enough, well, it doesn't seem like it's enough yet.
So you spent some time in court, which seemed like really valuable. You know, you have this discussion happening at the national level, but you were able to kind of paint a really intense picture of how it was playing out on the ground. Can you just describe a little bit about what happened from the days you were in court and just how chaotic it all seemed?
Yeah. So, gosh, I don't even know where to begin. It was really chaotic. Just to start out with, it seemed as though for the initial hearings, the first day I went was on a Monday. So they had even more cases than they would on other days because they would have everyone who was caught over the weekend, essentially. And basically what happens is these people are caught by Border Patrol and they will spend some time in Border Patrol custody, but they need to have their initial hearing within 1 business day of when they're arrested. And so typically what happens is after they spend a night or a few hours in custody of Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection, they are transferred to the Metropolitan Correctional Center, which is a prison downtown. And they go through a tuberculosis test and a variety of other screenings and are processed and given a jumpsuit and all of that. And then they need to be brought in for their initial hearing. And what was happening was that there was a big bottleneck at that facility. And in addition, a lot of the people were being held in detention facilities that were 90 minutes, a couple of hours away. And so in court, you had these defense attorneys who were saying, you know, we haven't been able to interview these clients yet. We haven't been able to get forms signed. So even if they can pay to be able to get out of custody, they won't be able to because they haven't signed these forms. You had judges that were frustrated because they didn't know how to get through all of these cases, you know, in the normal amount of time that they spend in court in their business day. And so it was a lot of chaos. And yesterday I was actually there for some of the sentencing. And there was one point where one of the judges had to tell the defense attorneys, hey, if I skip your client, let me know, because he had a wad of cases that he was going through. And he was like, if any of the papers stick together or anything like that, just let me know. So it's...
Wait, what would skipping a client entail? Like skipping the hearing? Accidentally forgetting to hold a hearing?
I mean, it wouldn't be the entire hearing. So the defendants were brought in, but in this case, it would mean he was going through one by one and reading people their rights and having them talk about their sentencing, having them plead guilty and those kinds of things. And so he's basically just going down a line with 10 people and saying, so-and-so, are you saying this is what you want? Or so-and-so, these are your rights. And so if they skip someone, then that's like a part of their due process, essentially part of the structure and procedure in court that isn't followed for that person. You
said it was even wreaking havoc for some of the U.S. Marshals. What's their role in there?
So the U.S. Marshals are sort of, they are like the security or the law enforcement arm of the courts, and their job is to, when someone is going through their hearing, to basically keep them in custody and get them to and from the court and make sure that things are safe within the court when the defendants are in trial. And so since there isn't enough detention space in San Diego, the U.S. Marshals were having to keep people who had their hearings in San Diego in Santa Ana and other facilities. And so now you have the Marshals who have to, in addition to whatever other responsibilities they have, are transporting these people on a bus 90 minutes in either direction for their hearing. And there are also safety standards in place that allow a certain amount of Marshals per person for them to go in without having any shackles or anything or any restraints. And that kind of slows down calendars. And so there was one judge, it looks like through court filings, that actually opted to shackle some of the defendants during their pretrial hearings again, which hasn't been done in a couple of years, just to be able to get more people into the courtroom one at a time. And I also noticed there were Border Patrol and ICE officers who were in the courtroom who I don't think are normally there, and I think maybe have been lent to kind of help deal with the volume.
What we're kind of seeing, if we step back a little bit, is a wholesale revision of the idea that you should prioritize border crimes at all, right? So we saw this with the Border Patrol, who's one of the chiefs talked to our Mario Coran about how it was always sort of seen with hostility in the Border Patrol, that they had to decide whether this person or that person was more appropriate to detain or go after, and that no matter what their background or whatever, you should just take everybody who is eligible for removal and go after them. And now we're seeing it with this sort of thing. Am I reading that right? We're watching a sort of wholesale revision of the idea that you can prioritize who's coming across the border illegally?
Yeah, I mean, I think past administrations have basically taken the stance that we only have so many resources, and there are so many people who have been living in the country without authorization, who are crossing without authorization, that we kind of have to make some value judgments of who we're going to detain, who we're going to criminally prosecute, because we just do not have the resources to do everything. And this administration is basically saying we're getting rid of those priorities and we are going to handle everyone.
Well, Maya Srikrishnan, she's done some great work on voiceofsandiego.org about all of these issues, plus the relationship of the immigration agents with the sheriff's department, and also you talked to some previous U.S. attorneys who saw some of this before. I'm curious. You talked to Alan Burson, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he was not only a former U.S. attorney, he ran the school district, but then he was also the Customs and Border Patrol chief under
Border czar.
Obama. Yeah. So what was his take on that?
Well, he was the U.S. attorney who made the decision back in 1994 to stop prosecuting so many misdemeanors. And he did that kind of in parallel with a bunch of other border security measures. So that was around the same time that Operation Gatekeeper went into effect, and we really started building up the border on San Diego, and being able to fingerprint people who were coming back and forth and just drastically reduce the number of people. And his take was that was a better way of dealing with it than just trying to criminally prosecute whoever you could.
It's interesting, though, that at the timing of that change, that it coincided with an increase in investment in border infrastructure. That it was a combination of building up the border fences beyond where they had been before, and also being more selective about what you actually prosecute.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think from Alan Burson's perspective, it was a coincidence. I think that was very strategic. And I think if you look at other parts of the border, things have happened differently. So it's my understanding that in Texas, for example, the number of misdemeanors hasn't fallen the way it has in the Southern District of California. So there are differences like that, but that was the way that he and other leaders at the time who were dealing with border issues decided to handle the influx of people who were coming back and forth at the time.
And so if there hasn't been a commensurate decrease in misdemeanors in the Texas border region over the last couple decades, that means presumably that they're not seeing this sort of crush of resources today.
I think they still are.
Okay.
I think that if you look the Rio Grande, for instance, that area has way more people who were apprehended every year than San Diego does. So even I don't even think they could have prosecuted everything. They may have prosecuted more. It may have been more of a strategy, but it's an increase for everyone.
Well, Maya, thank you for helping us understand everything, and it's really nice it's nice for us to have an authority on these issues as they peak even in our backyard here. Thank you.